Video games are unusual products that differ from other industrial goods in which electrical power, machines, and creative work are integrated. They are an aggregation of a variety of academic disciplines, including engineering, literature, the arts, and psychology, and can be considered a cultural tool for the fun required by society. The game arcades in the late 1970s were the places for boys to play rather rough kill the alien type of games. So I wanted to turn it into a brighter and more fun place where women and couples could feel comfortable going.
That was Toru Iwatani, the creator of one of video games, no scrub that, all of media's most recognisable characters, Pac-Man. Yes, believe that 94% of Americans recognise what this 300-degree circle is, and that makes him more recognisable than both Sonic, Mario, and, well, no, he's still got a few more pellets to chomp before he can take on Mickey Mouse. Regardless, that's not a bad statistic, is it? Just think the entire world of video games are literally beneath this guy. Sure, in more recent years, youngsters will argue whatever crazed obsession they're into will be more popular than Pac-Man, but when that's all over, it always comes back to Pac-Man. Without a doubt, one of the most recognisable shapes in all of video game history. 111 tiny little pixels make up his most iconic shape as it drops you in the middle of a neon blue bordered maze as you take on 244 pellets, running away from the ghost, chasing the ghost, and doing this repeatedly until you move on to the next stage. And of course, don't forget the fruit. Nothing needs to be explained when it comes to Pac-Man, it's simplicity at its most basic form, yet it's pushed the boundaries of what was expected from arcades at the time, and because of that, it captured the imaginations and wallets of everybody who saw it, no matter your age or your sex, and has even to this day continued to stand as the absolute king of all of gaming. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, guys. Let's go back to the beginning and take a look at the gargantuan world that is Pac-Man, where we will be looking into and confirming his origins, his tremendous legacy, his merchandise, and of course, his games. Welcome to Slope's Game Room. The year is 1955, and the Nakamura Manufacturing Company, which would eventually be renamed to simply Namco, had just started its long journey down the road of becoming an established entertainment empire after installing a couple of rocking horses on the roof of a Japanese shopping centre. The company was started by Masaya Nakayama with the equivalent of only $3,000 to his name, and those rocking horses were just a couple of old second-hand units that Nakamura-san would personally operate alone, welcoming guests, repairing them, polishing and cleaning them on a daily basis. And before long, Nakamura-san started to see a real driving interest in those coin-operated machines. Several already established arcade companies, as well as plenty of coin-op amusement companies, were fully taking over the Japanese market. Nakamura-san was obviously experiencing this ever-growing craze unfold right in front of him, and as he built relationships with several shopping centres and other dedicated family getaways, he started to lease several arcade machines from these companies to put into these establishments. This eventually led to the creation of their own coin-operated Elemeca machine, including the stupidly impressive 1970s Machine Racer, or F1 as it would eventually be rebranded to. But the real interesting part of the company's history piece came a little bit later on in the 70s. You see, one of the newer arcade manufacturers to enter the Japanese arcade space was a little known company known as Atari. Now obviously Atari was very well known on Western shores, with the co-founder Nolan Bushnell pushing it out to everybody he could, and Japan was next, with a little help from Namco. But it turns out that this was harder than expected.
We had real problems in Japan. Japan is a pretty closed market, difficult to get your product in, closed distribution. That's why we did the deal with Nakamura and Namco. He was willing to sort of break with tradition and start working with an American company. And he really made money on Breakout.
And make money he did, but not in the way you would expect. Breakout was indeed the latest and greatest Atari arcade unit, but due to Nolan Bushnell only sending over, supposedly, 15 units, it wasn't exactly doing all that well, even though everybody that played it seemed to love it. So what was the problem? Why did Nolan Bushnell send so few units? Well, that would be the Yakuza. Yes, you heard that right, the Yakuza, aka the Japanese Mafia. It turns out, unlike other gangs or criminal organizations around the world, this Japanese posse were incredibly versatile and highly intelligent, to the point where they had done quite well for themselves reverse engineering and then remaking the incredibly popular Breakout machines for themselves with incredible speed and efficiency. Whereas Atari and Namco's collaboration was very slow, creating the machines and shipping them over took time, and Atari was not willing to let Namco make these machines for themselves, whereas the Yakuza saw no problem in doing that exact thing. This led to Nakamura-san getting caught out sending his men in to investigate and eventually meeting up with the head of the Yakuza himself and simply asking them to stop what they're doing. But of course, a deal was thrown back in his face to work together to take hold of the entire Japanese arcade industry, which they no doubt would have accomplished if Nakamura-san accepted the offer. However, he rightfully refused, as there was simply no way that this would end well for anyone besides the Japanese Mafia leaders, and with this he went about his way to tackle the issue himself. Tensions were already pretty high between both Atari and Namco by this point, and now Namco had to deal with this. They had to take on the Yakuza. And the way they did that very thing was to beat them at their own game by outselling them. He quickly went to London to meet with an incredibly hungover Nolan Bushnell to explain this predicament and to get as many machines shipped over as possible. But after Bushy's mad night of drinking, he wasn't exactly in the freshest state, and the short meeting at the bar, according to Nakamura-san, was a complete waste of time. Now, just to add a little disclaimer here guys, Nolan Bushnell actually denies that these meetings ever took place. He doesn't understand why Breakout was selling so badly in Japan, and he doesn't remember anybody ever asking him for more units, so believe who you want to believe. Regardless of who you do believe, the counterfeit machines did in fact happen, and to combat this without the help of Atari, what Namco did next would change the course of the company from here on out. They decided to create the machines themselves without the authorization from Atari, just like the Japanese Mafia did, in an attempt to outsell the Japanese Mafia. So yeah, as Nolan Bushnell already stated, they made a lot of money doing this exact thing. This, among other fights between the two giants, would eventually lead to the odd lawsuit here and there, which isn't what this video is about. This video is about Namco's early days in the arcade business, and even though Breakout isn't exactly the first game they ever made, because you know, they didn't, it was actually a copy of another company's machine, it still led them down the path of creating their own arcade machines, and hiring Toru Iwatani. A young, excitable 22-year-old that joined the company in 1977. He had a keen interest in graphic arts and gaming, but his main passion and the reason he joined the company was to actually make pinball machines and not arcade machines. There was just one problem: the company didn't make pinball machines.
I liked pinball, and I thought I had joined a company which made pinball machines, but the company didn't make pinball machines. So I was quite disappointed. But then I thought, why not make something like a combination between pinball and a video game?
Now this is where that GB game comes into play that I have brought up in the past, and my opinion on that game hasn't exactly changed since then. You know the game Pong, right? You know the game Breakout, right? Well, this is essentially that, with a touch of pinball. A small white dot bounces around the screen, taking out small lines with every hit, and your job is to remove them all. It again isn't really all that different to Breakout apart from the random bumpers found in the middle of the playing field, just like a pinball machine. And as, well, okay as the game was, it was literally just that. It was just okay. And although it did eventually spawn a few spin-offs and sequels, which are available via the Namco Museum Collection on the PlayStation, its biggest problem was that ball and paddle arcade games were so incredibly common in the arcade space, making this game merely a drop of knockoff cola in whatever sweaty arcade that it found itself in, which was actually, sadly, almost none of them, and because of that, it has become an incredibly rare cabinet to ever find in the wild. In fact, games like this were coming out left, right and centre, so much so that arcade goers were obviously getting quite bored of them. However, in 1978, a brand new arcade game hit the market and it blew everything out of the water, and nope, I'm not talking about Pac-Man. Taito were the guys behind this one, and that game was none other than Space Invaders. Yep, Space Invaders, another game that is one of the most iconic arcade games ever made. A game that you play as an actual game character, I suppose, against 3 different types of easily identifiable pixelated aliens and a UFO, to an ever-increasing heartbeat type soundtrack that quite literally captivated players and still does to this very day. The game became so incredibly popular that some arcades would literally have nothing but this one game several times over. And when it was eventually released in America later that same year, a similar effect impacted all who played it there too. And just like before, crazy amounts of Space Invader inspired games heavily hit production from everyone trying to grab and hold on to that sweet alien pie. And honestly, Namco was no different, but we will cover the game Galaxian another time. It was becoming apparent that if you were clever enough to create something new and innovative for the arcades and you did it right, then that is what you needed to do. And although there were obviously some fantastic innovations during this time that did indeed try something new, the safest bet was sadly to copy instead. However, Iwatani-san, our pinball-obsessed game designer of GB, was actually one of those guys that wanted to do it differently. He was bored of constant space shooting war games, thanks to Space Invaders, that filled every arcade, bowling alley and takeaway that he visited, and decided to look at one of the new innovations that Space Invaders brought to the table that the vast majority hadn't thought about up to this point. It's not about aliens and it's not about the space theme, it's about you, the character that you play as in the game. As basic as that may look, that little shooting rocket at the bottom of the screen wasn't just a moving target, it was a character that you needed to control in order to save the planet. This and the want to move away from warlike aggressive shooting games was indeed the seeds of something astronomically special. If he could make a game that had an easily distinguishable character, then not only would it perhaps be something new and exciting, but moving it away from the angry nature of what was popular at the time, it may even invite a female audience to the arcades, which were most definitely dominated by males at the time. Space Invaders also gave another piece of inspiration to Iwatani-san, this time from the developer himself. Because guys, in case you didn't know, the creator and the brains behind Space Invaders actually came from a dream that the creator had one night, and apparently that went a little like this.
Once upon a time, there were some kids in a school being attacked by aliens, waiting for Father Christmas to arrive as the sky filled with rows upon rows of attacking alien scumbags. The desperate children's only means of attack was a laser beam they had built from an old car battery, spark plugs and a hubcap.
Nope, didn't make that up. Iwatani-san found this concept rather inspirational and decided to base his next game on plenty of classic anime and Western cartoons that appealed to a worldwide audience such as Casper and more notably Q-Taro the Ghost, the story of a chubby ghost who often found himself getting into trouble and eating way too much in the process rather than whatever the latest craze was in the arcades. The idea was to take kanji words from these popular, loved by all no matter your sex inspirations such as Taberu, which translates to eat, to eventually come up with the premise for his new game. From this eating theme came the next kanji word, kuchi, which was the shape of a square, which ultimately became the inspiration for the character himself. And the very next piece of the Pac-Man puzzle is the one game in fact that everybody in the world thinks they know. The pizza thing. It's often believed that Iwatani-san went out to lunch for pizza, took one slice, looked down and saw what would eventually become the most recognisable video game character of all time. And although that is indeed true to a degree, as I just explained, it was a fair bit more complicated than simply a pizza missing a slice, although it's fair to say that the easiest and most digestible way to market the creation of the game is to say that that was the inspiration for the game. Get it? Digestible?
It's half true. In Japanese, the character for mouth, kuchi, is a square shape. It's not circular like the pizza, but I decided to round it out. There was the temptation to make the Pac-Man shape less simple. While I was designing this game, someone suggested we add eyes, but we eventually discarded that idea because once we added eyes, we would want to add glasses and maybe a moustache. There would just be no end to it. Food is the other part of the basic concept. In my initial design, I had to put the player in the midst of food all over the screen. As I thought about it, I realised the player wouldn't know exactly what to do. The purpose of the game would be obscure. So I created a maze and put the food in it. Then whoever played the game would have some structure by moving through the maze. The Japanese have a slang word, paku paku. They used to describe the motion of the mouth opening and closing while one eats. The name Puckman came from that word.
With this idea quickly growing and a small team around him, they decided to move forward with the whole Monster Gobbler idea, but in an attempt to up the Space Invader ante, they decided to change the monsters to ghosts. And cute ghosts, of course, because, you know, females. And to push the idea even further, all 4 ghosts would have set characteristics in the way that they chase Puckman, which meant that the power-up for our poor defenseless circle would be needed to take on these ghoulies. And this inspiration actually came from, and I love that this is a real fact, Popeye. God, do I love Popeye. Whilst all this was going on, Namco's other team, the ones working on the Space Invader destroyer that was Galaxian, released that game in 1979, and although it wasn't the first ever colour video game, it was indeed the first at taking RGB colour graphics and creating multicoloured sprites. Obviously not a big deal now, but if there ever was a Space Invader killer, then this was gonna be it. Iwatani-san liked this, he liked it a lot. After all, his last game, GB, that gave the illusion of multicoloured graphics, was only able to do this by sticking stripes of coloured cellophane onto the screen. So, he decided to implement this into his new game so that the ghosts with different techniques would be easily identifiable, and of course those colours would be softer pastel-like colours so that he could continue to market it towards females and couples. Over the next year, which was an incredibly long time for an arcade game to take back then, the design and recreation of the ghost continued to evolve, and during this time, Iwatani-san's love for pinball grew as 2 new versions of his classic GB game got released called Bombi and QTQ. And it was actually here that we possibly got to see our first look at one of the earlier designs of one of the Pac-Man ghosts, because in the game QTQ, you can actually see 3 pink ghosts at the top of the screen, but slightly redesigned. Anyway, Puckman was eventually released on October 10th, 1979. A whole 1 year and 5 months of development went into the game, which again was completely unheard of back then, and the response was, well, it was okay. Space Invaders was crazily popular still, and Namco's very own Galaxian had people queuing up to play it. Puckman, however, was a very strange cabinet, often looked at by people that were waiting to play on something else.
The game was taken to a building in Shibuya that no longer exists. It was a thin, chimney-shaped building with 7 or 8 floors consisting of several movie theatres. On the top floor there was a very long, narrow room where the couples, having just seen the movies, would go up to have a little enjoyment before they returned home, so they weren't necessarily gamers. The women and couples were very happy about the machine, very excited. They came up to it and put their hands on it, so we thought that our target concept had been very much in sync and correct. They played it and they were more or less satisfied. They figured out how to play it. It's not a difficult game. On the other hand, the core gamers, the men, were not necessarily very excited about it, but it was for people who didn't play games on a daily basis, women, children, the elderly. It's not like people sat around and played the machine all day though, so we didn't think it would be a major hit. I didn't think that the US and Europe would take it up because it's a rather slow, relaxing game. At that time, what was popular overseas were more thrilling games, and I felt that perhaps the rhythm of Pac-Man wasn't matching the needs of overseas users.
The design was very different from what you came to expect. With its big, mostly white arcade cabinet, the ghosts were named Akabe, Pinky, Aosuke and Gazuka, and this was when Midway got involved. These guys licensed both Galaxian and Puckman, and just like they did with Space Invaders, they decided to westernize the whole thing. Firstly, the garish cabinet got changed from white to yellow, Puckman himself actually ended up looking even more odd, and the names of the ghosts got changed to Blinky, Pinky, Inky and Clyde. A strange move that, although did help with not only the localization of the cabinet, did raise the question, why didn't they just rename them into their translated names, which were obviously Chaser, Ambusher, Fickle and Stupid, obviously given to them due to the movements that they took when chasing Puckman. Oh yeah, there was one other thing that they changed too, the name from Puckman to Pac-Man. But why did they do this? Seriously? Are you actually asking that? Have you not seen Scott Pilgrim?